face it, I'm a pig.
Porco Rosso is one of my favorite movies, and I say that even though I wouldn't call it a great film. Don't get me wrong, it is great in its own way, but compared to other Studio Ghibli productions like Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, or Grave of the Fireflies, it's not quite on that level, which, to be fair, very few films are. Still, I love Porco Rosso, imperfections and all, if for no other reason than it just makes me happy, and it somehow manages to do so in spite of the fact that it tells a pretty sad story. It's also a bit unique for a Studio Ghibli film because of what it isn't, namely a fantasy. Despite being helmed by the great Hayao Miyazaki, who directed Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke, which are both fantasies, Porco Rosso isn't, at least not really. Yes, it takes place in a somewhat altered reality, but that reality is closer to ours than you might think a movie about a talking pig would be. The biggest difference, after you get over the whole talking pig thing, is probably that Porco's world is a bit nicer than ours. Like in his world, a bunch of schoolgirls can get kidnapped by pirates and it winds up being a fun little outing for them.
Could use some blood.
Or a grenade can be dropped in the middle of a crowd and it plays for comic relief. I also love how all the good guys and bad guys all know each other and all hang out in the same bar, yet the place never gets shot up.
Of course, Gina, we would never fight within 50 miles of your place.
So yeah, on the surface this seems like a silly kids movie, and in some ways it totally is, yet for such a fun, seemingly lighthearted film, again, it tells a pretty sad story about a man consumed with guilt. I've always been fascinated by what makes one story more compelling than another, particularly when the plot is dead simple but still holds my interest. Whenever that happens, it usually means there's something deeper going on beneath the surface. To determine if that's the case here, let's take a closer look, starting with a quick synopsis. Porco Rosso is about a seaplane pilot who works as a bounty hunter in the Adriatic Sea in the years following World War I. Because he's so exceptional at his job, he earns the collective indignation of all the seaplane pirates that he constantly thwarts, and in their desperation to beat him, the pirates basically do what the criminals in The Dark Knight did. They pool their resources and hire someone to do what they can.
Simple. We kill the Batman.
But instead of hiring the Joker, they hire an American pilot named Curtis. Knowing the pirates and Curtis are gunning for him, and that his plane is hardly up to the task, Porco flies off to get repairs. On the way, Curtis intercepts him and shoots him down, but Porco survives and makes it to Milan, where he meets up with his old mechanic. The men in Milan are mostly gone because there's no work, so Porco's plane is built by women, chiefly among them Theo, a 17-year-old engineer who is amazing at her job and who, upon the project's completion, insists against Porco's wishes on returning to the Adriatic with him to ensure the plane she designed runs properly. Upon returning home, Porco learns his hideout has been discovered and all his enemies have come for their pound of flesh. But before they can get it, they're stopped by Theo, who says if they have any honor, they'll fight him in the sky, which of course none of them want to do.
I'd fight Porco, but my plane has engine trouble.
Fortunately for them, Curtis shows up and accepts the challenge on their behalf. Since Curtis has this habit of falling in love with any woman he meets, he instantly falls in love with Theo and says if he wins, she'll have to marry him. Against Porco's wishes, again, Theo accepts, but says if Porco wins, Curtis will have to pay off all his debts. With the terms drawn, the two aces meet and have a spectacular aerial battle that then devolves into a boxing match.
Come on, Porco!
Obviously, I've left out a few details in the name of brevity, but that's pretty much what happens. So let me ask you this. Does what I just described sound like a sad story? Not really, right? Sounds more like a fun, silly, exciting movie, which it is. The sad part is surprisingly easy to miss because it either takes place outside the main plot's timeline or because it's hiding in plain sight. Porco is, of course, a pig. Not because he was born that way, but because he was cursed to look like one. Now, in a lesser story, or not even a lesser one, but just a more traditional one, the movie would center around that curse. It'd be all about why was he cursed? How was he cursed? What does he have to do in order to lift the curse? And most important, does he succeed in doing so? However, in this story, not one of those questions is answered, at least not directly. The only times the curse is explicitly mentioned is early on when Gina, an important character I sneakily failed to mention before, says to Porco, or Marco as she calls him,
"How are you ever going to break that stupid curse on you, Marco?"
And then again near the end of the story when Theo says,
"What if I kiss you, Porco? You've heard of the fairy tale where the girl kisses the frog and it turns him back into a handsome prince?"
Come on. You've got to save it for somebody special, for crying out loud.
Don't you like me?
I will say the movie has a slightly weird vibe going on with Theo being mildly sexualized.
Thank you! And you know, my butt is bigger than it looks.
Then again, Curtis does have to fall in love with her at first sight, so I guess you could justify it that way. Anyway, those are the only times the curse is directly addressed, and in both cases, Porco's immediate response doesn't tell us anything about the curse itself. It does, however, tell us how he feels about it. He acts as if he deserves it. When he says to Gina,
Face it, I'm a pig.
he does so with complete resignation and finality, and he repeats this mantra throughout the film.
Sorry, I'm a pig. I'll leave that to you humans.
So why is Porco so resigned to his fate? Why isn't he trying everything possible to lift the curse? Is he just a really stoic person who accepts his fate because he knows he can't change it? If so, I'm sure he'd get Marcus Aurelius' nod of approval, but that's not really what's going on. Again, Porco doesn't just accept his fate, he acts like he deserves it. Consider the previous scene with Gina. Before she asks how his curse can be lifted, she laments that Porco scratched his face out of a photograph she has of him and her late husband.
That's my favorite picture. I can't believe you scribbled over your face. That's the only picture left of you as a human.
Can you imagine doing this? Scratching your face out of the only picture you share with someone you admire who's no longer alive? That's not something you do just because you're having a bad hair day. Porco never comes out and specifically explains why he did this, but his actions hardly reflect someone who's proud of himself. It seems more the opposite, that he's ashamed, which again begs the question, why? I have to tip my cap to Miyazaki here. The man is a master storyteller. He understands that if your audience wants to know something, you don't just tell them. You either make them figure it out for themselves, or you make them wait. Though we get our first hint that Porco is riddled with guilt during this early scene with Gina, which is then subtly reinforced throughout the story, we don't learn why until halfway through the final act during this scene with Theo. Because she put everything on the line for Porco, he decides to share something deeply personal with her. Now, I said at the start of the video that Porco Rosso, while outstanding, isn't perfect. For me, the third act is the weakest. It's not that there's anything wrong with it or that I would change anything about it, it's just that it ends in a big showdown, and with most showdowns, you usually know how it's gonna go. However, the third act also contains the film's best sequence, which I would describe as perfect. It occurs when Porco tells Theo about a fateful day during the war, when he was out flying with his squad in the Italian Air Force. Next to him was his best friend Bellini, who'd just gotten married to Gina. Yeah, that Gina, which should tell you why Porco's feelings towards her are somewhat complicated.
Gina says, don't you say Gina like you know her.
Surprised by an enemy squadron, they suddenly found themselves in a vicious dogfight, and before long Porco realized, much to his horror, that he was the only one from his team left. Thinking he was done for, he fought till he blacked out, but then he woke up and saw this.
Berlini! I thought you were dead! Come back here! Where do you think you're going? What about Gina? You can't leave her alone! Let me go instead!
This scene destroys me. It's so sad. It's in stark contrast to much of the rest of the film, and it finally explains why Porco feels so guilty. He was the only member of his team to survive, and it wasn't because he was just better than everyone else. Again, he blacked out. He should have died. The fact that he survived didn't make him feel lucky or grateful. It made him feel undeserving and ashamed. When Theo says,
God was telling you it wasn't your time yet.
Porco refuses to cut himself any slack.
Seems to me he was telling me I was a pig and maybe I deserved to be all alone.
Though this sequence only takes up a small fraction of the overall runtime, it serves as the emotional anchor of the story. It weighs on everything else that happens. After you see it, even these lighthearted scenes become tinged with sadness. You realize Porco's living in a kind of self-imposed purgatory in which he constantly judges himself to be a bad person. I gotta confess, whenever I watch this movie, I always start off envying Porco just a little. I mean, he lives in paradise on his own private island. When we first meet him, he's chilling with a bottle of wine next to him. He's got some tunes bumping. His sweet ride is parked nearby. He's got an awesome job that he's amazing at and that everyone thinks he's amazing at. He's got permanent VIP status at the hottest club around, and the fact that he's a pig somehow doesn't hurt him with the ladies at all.
Porco, tell me about your rescue.
Next time, when it's just the two of us.
By the way, this is one reason I love animation. It allows you to accept almost anything at face value. Like, can you imagine if this was a live-action movie about a guy who looks like a pig? I know they can do amazing stuff these days with CGI, but I still think it'd be creepy and distracting and wouldn't allow you to suspend your disbelief. Yet with animation, particularly the brilliant old-school, hand-drawn Studio Ghibli kind, you just go with it. No one else makes a big deal out of Porco being a pig, so neither do you. Anyway, Porco's world may look like heaven at first glance, but as the story goes on, you realize that he is not in a good place mentally. It's always sad when people are cruel to each other, but it's equally sad when people are cruel to themselves. However, now that we know why he's so cruel to himself, we can go back to these questions regarding the curse that the movie never answers directly. I've talked before about good ambiguity versus bad ambiguity, the main difference being that with the bad kind, you're left with a bunch of questions you're unable to answer for yourself, which is frustrating, whereas with good ambiguity, you have enough information to answer questions for yourself, or the answers just don't matter. Thanks to this brilliant sequence, we should be able to address these questions, at least somewhat. So, moment of truth, why is Porco cursed? One issue I've kind of ignored in this video is fascism, which took hold in Italy during the time the movie is set, and which Porco steadfastly refuses to take part in.
How about buying some patriotic bonds to help serve our nation?
Sorry, I'm a pig. I'll leave that to you humans.
He even says he'd rather be a pig than a fascist.
But I'd rather be a pig than a fascist.
That's an important statement. Refusing to support fascism during that time in Italy was a very dangerous thing that would certainly make you an outcast. You could argue the movie is saying that to be a non-fascist in a time of fascism is analogous to being a pig amongst humans. Yet, as nice as that sounds, it doesn't actually explain Porco's curse very well. Yes, he is an outcast and an outlaw who refuses to get swept up in the nationalist hysteria that's gripped his homeland, but that same label applies to pretty much everyone in this movie. They all operate outside the law, including Fio and her relatives. They help Porco build his plane knowing full well the government is after him, and Ferrari, a member of the armed forces, helps Porco evade detection and escape back to the Adriatic. If refusing to be a fascist is what turns Porco into a pig, everyone else should be too. While fascism plays an important role, it's the backdrop of the story, not the subject. Alright, so with that out of the way, what really explains Porco's curse? For me, it's a combination of the guilt he feels for surviving, the shame he's carried with him since, and just an overall negative view of mankind. Now, does that completely explain how a human was turned into a human-swine hybrid? No, but a deeper explanation wouldn't really help the story. Like, if a witch popped out of nowhere and pointed her wand at him, it wouldn't make the movie better. It wouldn't even make sense. Porco wasn't cursed by a witch. He cursed himself. The notion of a person being turned into an animal is hardly a new one.
Tale as old as time.
The movie even references one of those tales.
You've heard of the fairy tale where
The thing I love about Miyazaki's version of this tale is that he basically took the internal feelings of guilt and shame and gave them a physical manifestation. Porco looks the way he feels about himself. That's why he's so resigned to the curse. He thinks he deserves it.
Face it, I'm a pig.
As to how he can lift the curse, we get our answer to that during this scene with Fio when she wakes up and for just a moment sees the real Marco, which is the only time we the audience also see him within the timeline of the plot.
Marco?
So why does this happen? What's different about this moment? Well, for most of the movie, Porco regards himself as selfish.
I only fly for myself.
But in this scene, he knows he's not thinking about himself. His concern is Fio. She saved his life back here, then she put her entire future on the line to set up this showdown with Curtis, and while she's confident that Porco's gonna beat Curtis, the real reason she did this is because she thinks he's a good person who's worth fighting for, which is very different from the way Porco feels about himself. He thinks he's this ugly, selfish, undeserving pig, which would be sad enough even if it were true, but in Porco's case it's doubly sad because it isn't. His perception of himself is wrong. Fio, Gina, and even Curtis in his own indirect way are there to alter Porco's perception of himself and his perception of the world around him, which is what has to happen for him to lift the curse. He's got to do the same stuff we all have to if we hope not to be miserable. Be kind to ourselves, make peace with the past, and most important, we have to decide that life, even though it often sucks, is still worth the struggle, and that humanity, for all its faults, is still worth being a part of. As for the final question, does Porco succeed in lifting the curse? Well, as Fio says,
that's our secret.
In a lesser movie that would seriously piss me off, but here I actually love it. Again, good ambiguity beats bad ambiguity because it gives you enough information for you to decide for yourself. And that is why I love this goofy movie about a talking pig that totally gut punches me right in the feeling zone whenever I watch it.